Welcome back to the show. My guest today is someone whose work has shaped the way millions of people think about freedom, choice, and meaning, often in ways we didn't realize we needed. Barry Schwartz is a psychologist, author, and thought leader, best known for his groundbreaking books, The Paradox of Choice, Why We Work, and Practical Wisdom. His ideas have influenced leaders in business, education, and public policy, and his TED Talks, I was counting them up. I was counting them up on the TED website and on YouTube, and I think they've surpassed 35 million views. I first had the privilege of speaking with Barry back in 2017, and a lot has changed since then. Technology has accelerated, AI has entered the mainstream, and questions about purpose, judgment, and human agency have become more urgent than ever. So I invited Barry back to explore how his thinking has evolved in this new era, where decisions are increasingly shaped by algorithms and efficiency is often prized over wisdom. Barry, thank you so much for being here. It's an absolute treat.
It's really a pleasure. It's really a pleasure. You say I've influenced millions of people, but if that were true, it wouldn't be the case that the problem I wrote about in 2004 would have become an order of magnitude worse. So the people who are listening to me are not the people who are making the decisions that shape society, unfortunately.
I was thinking about this. Sometimes you can read a book and it's fascinating, but almost 1 month after it comes out, the ideas already seem dated. And I was thinking about the topics that you've chosen, the paradox of choice, why we work, practical wisdom. And I don't know how you were tapping into the zeitgeist or something, but a lot of these ideas seem, paradox of choice came out, I think 2004, 2005, 20 years ago.
Yep.
And these ideas seem almost as timeless and as important today than they ever have.
Well, as I say, unfortunately, I think you're right, because, a lot of it is discretionary, and we've not used our discretion wisely. I would say, part of it is, of course, we're being pushed along by the companies that make money the more time we spend torturing ourselves deciding what to buy. So, we're not completely free agents here, but I'm revising The Paradox of Choice with a former student of mine. We're in the middle of it right now, and it's not because any of the arguments in the book have proven not to stand up. It's that the world has changed, and changed mostly for the worse vis-a-vis the stuff that I write about. So I want to make it relevant to people who are in their 20s, and the examples we use are just not cut out for this generation of people in their 20s. So we're updating the book.
I'm now cautious to ask my first question because I don't want you to give away any spoilers unless you don't want to. But I was going to say, if you were to update The Paradox of Choice today, what would be the most significant new chapter?
Well, there are a couple of new chapters that we're going to work on. One of them is barely even hinted at in the original book, and this is research that I've done with this person who's writing the book with me, and that is what having an unlimited number of options does to your conception of who you are as a person. And what we suspected and what we found is that if there are 3 kinds of genes to choose from, the genes you buy rarely say much to you or the world about who you are, because there just isn't enough variety. But when there are 2,000 kinds of genes or 20,000 kinds of genes, then whether you like it or not, your choice of genes is a statement of identity. And the result of having this extra explosion of choice in comparison to the way things were 20 years ago is that the stakes of every decision we make have gone up, because you're not just clothing your body, you're also deciding what statement to make to the world. And, Facebook and especially the backward facing camera have only exacerbated the problem because it's so obvious that, how you look is a statement about who you are. So there's going to be a chapter about choice and the self, which had not really occurred to me. And the rationale really is, there's a sense in which even when all you've got is two options, what you choose says something about you, but it can't possibly say as much about you because, everybody in the world has option A or option B. So your uniqueness is hardly determined by the clothes you buy or the food you eat. But when the options multiply, then all of a sudden you can express your unique identity that way. And people, I think, believe that that's true. And they torture themselves because there's a particular identity they want or they want to display. And what you order in a restaurant has become a major existential issue.
I know that feeling. Well, it's interesting because when you say that, it's almost these two, like on the one hand, the human need and desire to be unique, be, one of a kind, and yet on the other side is this desperate desire to belong and to be a part of a tribe and to connect. And it's like, I want to be unique enough, but not so unique. I still want to be the same. And so it's kind of those two things.
And that's the second new chapter. It's a focus on the notion that choice is good, but there can be too much of a good thing. And so the argument is not to eliminate choice, but rather to appreciate that adding options does not necessarily make things better. So there's a sweet spot where you can somehow, it's a hard line to walk, you can somehow both be an individual and belong. And when you tip too much in the direction of limited options, and I don't mean just about what clothes you wear, but, what kind of work you do, who you marry, what kind of romantic relationships you have, et cetera, big decisions, not just trivial ones. When you tip too far on the limited choice, then people feel like they can't be who they want to be. And when you essentially break all the rules, just knock down all the guardrails, well, then what you've got is 9 billion individuals feeling like there's nobody who's their people. And finding the magic middle ground and then managing to sustain it as you get pushed around by all kinds of social forces is a major challenge. And it wasn't a challenge when I was growing up because the choice sets were limited. So most of us were trying to bust out because it seemed like the world was too constrained. And by the time my kids were born, that was not at all, that wasn't true anymore. And you sort of felt the need to put your arms around them and hold them close because the world had become so much more chaotic than it had been when we were growing up. So there'll be another chapter about the sweet spot. And there's been wonderful research, not done by me, showing across different countries that if you sort of scale them in terms of how tight or loose they are, how traditional and how individualistic they are, and measure various things, physical health, life expectancy, psychological health, and so on, societies that are too tight and societies that are too loose, people suffer. And it's societies that have somehow found a way to both identify and preserve a middle ground where people seem to thrive, both physically and psychologically. And the problem then is, where's the middle ground? How do you figure out where it is? And then how do you sustain it? So there'll be a chapter about that. Now, nobody's going to buy the book because they'll, your 80 million listeners will hear me say it and they'll figure, I don't need to buy this book. I heard it all already.
It's so interesting how so many things come back to this concept of like the middle ground. From flow research, you don't want to have a task too hard that it gives you anxiety. You don't want it to be so boring that you disengage. That idea of the Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold. If you look at like Taoism, the way, you don't have the extremes, and it kind of comes back again and again.
It's absolutely true. And even in little kids, there's a classic research where you take a toddler and a parent go into a room and there are toys scattered around the room. You put the toddler down. And as long as the caretaker is present, the toddler will explore, play with the toys, see what they're like. If the caretaker walks out of the room, the toddler huddles in a corner. And so what you see, even in, 8-month-olds, is that there's a kind of optimal level of arousal. And when your caretaker is with you, you're calm. And so you try to add stimulation. When your caretaker is absent, you're not calm and you do what you can to reduce stimulation. So I think this is a very, very general principle that applies in a lot of domains. Too much of a good thing is too much.
I think something that's really interesting about the choice discussion is, well, first of all, when we spoke in March 2017, I don't think, well, not only just us, I don't think anyone could have predicted or foreseen how the next 8 years was going to play out in terms of all the advances in what's happening in AI, machine learning. And
Really?
I think it's particularly interesting now because on the one hand, things are moving faster and faster and faster, more data, more information, and we're also living in this really interesting time where I think you discussed it. The problem isn't just too much choice anymore. It's that the choices we're given are shaped by forces that we don't understand and don't control. We have algorithms, we have prediction systems, we have Spotify saying this is your next playlist. We have dating apps saying these are the people you should talk to, swipe with. And so on the one hand, we have more choices than ever, and our choices are highly curated. And so we're almost served on a platter. These are the best choices for you. And so how do you look at that argument or that idea?
It's interesting. On the one hand, it solves a problem, and on the other hand, it creates one. If you go into a department store that has not been curated for you, 90% of what's there, you can just walk right by. But when you instead get a set of options from Amazon or some other online purveyor or Netflix, you have this sense that every single damn thing that you're seeing is something that you ought to have some interest in. And the result is that you've now got a large number of options, all of which are attractive, or somebody thinks all of them should be attractive. So there's all kinds of stuff you don't have to sort through, which is a blessing. But how do you sort through what's left? And with something like Netflix, what's left is 2,000 options. So it's not like the problem has been solved. It's always been true that we think that the choices that we're offered are essentially uncurated and unlimited, but they've been curated. They're curated by retailers, they're curated by marketers. So we're getting to see a subset of what we might see. And the things that they think are going to be most attractive to most consumers are placed in places that it is extremely hard for us to miss as we stroll through the shelves of the supermarket or the department store. So there's a lot of manipulation that we just kind of took for granted. It's the way things are. And I don't know that it's worse that algorithms are doing it, except that algorithms are likely doing it better than the marketers did 25 years ago. So it may feel like you're being more manipulated just because it's doing a better job.
So it's actually it's not new. This has been happening since probably the dawn of advertising. It's just the quality and the sophistication and the amount of metadata and the amount of being able to do it at scale has rapidly increased.
There's a giant in the early days of advertising once said, everybody knows that half of what we do is a complete waste of time and money. It's just that nobody knows which half. And I think the change from then to now is that people do know, and it isn't a half. It's quite astonishing how well marketers can target their audiences, and the technology means that they don't have to shoot for the mean. They can shoot for you, and then they can shoot for me, and we see different promotions and different ads and different products, and so it feels creepy. And if you haven't reduced the domain of possibilities, it hasn't solved the choice problem. In one respect, it's reduced the number of options because you only get to see a subset of what's out there. But on the other hand, every option you see is a serious candidate. So it's not making it any easier for you. That's my sense.
Last time we spoke, we talked about this idea of maximizers and satisficers. So, for example, I go to New York for a weekend and I want to go out for a meal. And, in the case of a satisficer, it'll be like, okay, I feel like Thai tonight. And you look up and it's like, oh, this one's got good reviews. I'll go there. So I find a good enough option. The maximizer, on the other hand, whether it's a partner, whether it's a meal out, whether it's the new mobile phone, whether it's a holiday, it's this idea of I want to find the best, and I'm going to search and I'm going to look for the best step, however long it takes. And you spoke about one of the challenges with that for maximizers is this idea in a world of limitless possibilities, even when they make the decision, there's often a dissatisfaction afterwards. They're thinking maybe something I didn't get to, maybe that could have been better. And now looking, this concept of maximizers, how do you think, talking about what we just spoke about in an era where AI claims to optimize everything, partners, jobs, playlists, what happens to maximizers now? Does this promise of a perfect choice ease their anxiety, or does it make it worse?
It sure as hell doesn't make it better. It's a false god to look for. There is no best. And if you feel like you need to find the best, it requires you to do what we call an exhaustive search. The only way to know you've got the best is if you've examined every option. What is the best movie for me to watch on Netflix tonight? By the time I figure that out, it will be way past my bedtime. So and as you point out, the more you feel the need to search, the more you can anticipate what you will be giving up by not choosing attractive options. There's a romantic comedy that you've seen before. It's really funny. You loved it, but you're in the mood for something more serious. So you choose something more serious and you spend the whole time with a long face at the serious movie you're watching, thinking about how much pleasure you'd be getting if you'd watched the romantic comedy. Who needs that? There's a New Yorker cartoon that I show when I give talks of a young woman who's got a sweatshirt on, and the sweatshirt says Brown, very prestigious university in the U.S., but underneath it, but my first choice was Yale. And so the question is, are you going to get the most out of Brown if what's the idea in your head every day that you're there is that your first choice was Yale, and however good Brown is, Yale would have been better? This is not the right way to go through life. And what's interesting to me is that satisficing, which is a made-up word, not by me, but by a very distinguished psychologist, economist, 75 years ago. Satisficing is not a neutral description. What people hear when you say that is you're settling. And what is implied but does not need to be said is you are just settling. And in other words, you are using standards that are too low. The world is making wonderful possibilities available, and you're settling for mediocre. So all the pressure is on us to raise our standards in a way that is extremely unhelpful, and I think produces all kinds of second guessing of every decision you make, paralysis, so that you don't make a decision, and et cetera. That's what the book's about. And that has only gotten worse as we feel that we have more access to information at our fingertips.
I was on a walk with my girlfriend yesterday, and we were speaking about something which, for some, this might seem unromantic, but it's I spoke about the idea that I'm under no illusion that I don't think I am the best person she could have ever ended up with. We both found someone who we really like, and each day, every day, we choose and we decide to be with each other and to, almost like a plant, to give it water and to give it sunlight and to give it sunshine and I feel that is, rather than a settling or a passive thing, I think that's almost incredibly romantic, because in a world of endless options and people, I'm choosing to ignore everyone else and to put my limited time, energy, resources, love, attention towards you, and vice versa. And I don't take that for granted. I think that's incredibly romantic.
It is, and it's really quite a profound insight, I believe, because we have come to think, when it comes to romantic attachments, that the problem is in the search. You find the right person, and then life takes care of itself. That is completely wrong. Mm-hmm. The problem is in what you do after the search is over. That's when the work begins, because you don't discover a perfect match. You discover someone with whom to create a perfect match. And that takes work, listening to the other person. So thinking that you've solved this life problem by finding a partner means you sort of get lazy and neglectful and all that stuff. You stop listening, and the result is that the relationship goes bad. So if you see it as the beginning of the work rather than the end of the work, you're more likely to invest the kind of time, energy, and thoughtfulness into creating a relationship that relationships require. And it's amazing how I think this was more clear when the options were smaller, and you couldn't choose from thousands of potential mates. There were 20 people roughly your age who were unattached in your town. Well, you knew that you weren't going to get a perfect person. You were going to get a good person. And then the task of making a great relationship began. But now it seems, since we can, examine everybody everywhere, if we find the right person, it's just smooth sailing the rest of the way. And of course, it's not.
I heard you speak about AI might be the most available conversation partner specifically for the younger generations, not necessarily having a strong network of people to have deep, close, meaningful conversations with. From a psychological perspective, what's happening when people form relationships with AI assistants or rely on them for decision making?
I think this is a completely open question. It's sort of like, what is splitting the atom asking the question, what is splitting the atom going to do in 1930? I have no idea how people will end up interacting with AI. The one crucial difference with AI, between AI as a source of social engagement, in contrast to other human beings, is that there's a kind of required reciprocity when you're talking to a friend. You got to understand the friend. The friend has to understand you. You have to figure out what your friend needs. Your friend has to figure out what you need. So the back and forth that occurs is one where each of you is trying to provide support for the other. AI at the moment is simply a tool. So you don't have to worry about that. You know, the question you ask, it's sort of, if you'll pardon the politics, it's Trumpian. The question you ask is, what can I get out of this other thing, you know, to make my life better? And since this other thing isn't, a living, breathing thing, I feel no responsibility for its welfare. I can easily see it making us even more narcissistic than we already are, because there's nothing pushing us to worry about the other. And the other, as it gets better and better and smarter, can provide all kinds of really beneficial input to us. But it's totally one way, and that can produce some really bad habits. But I just think it's crazy to for people to assert with any confidence what AI is going to look like and what it's going to do to well-being at this stage of the game. The one thing I'm pretty confident about is that it is sure going to screw up employment. And societies recover from major technological changes that make some jobs obsolete, but the recovery takes a generation, maybe more than a generation, and there's a lot of suffering that goes on while that recovery is slowly happening. And I fear that that is not avoidable. That's going to happen. And it's going to happen to people who don't expect it to happen to them, because they are so highly skilled, highly trained, that they think they're bulletproof, and they aren't. So, that terrifies me. But the other stuff, I think there's an enormous potential for this to be used well and helpfully. My concern is that now that it is so profit-driven already, there's very little reason to think that the people who are pulling the strings are going to care very much about whether it enhances collective social and individual welfare. They're going to be interested in how much ka-ching they hear. I've learned a hard lesson as I've watched what, incredibly successful operations like Facebook turned into when it comes to having any confidence that the direction of AI development is going to be focused on welfare. It's going to be focused on what people are willing to pay for.
You've acknowledged the potential, I emphasize the word potential, for AI to promote human flourishing if developed and applied with explicit aim of enhancing well-being. Can you elaborate on what that might look like? Developed with the explicit aim of enhancing well-being, what might that look like?
Well, so in the workplace, what it would look like is taking the tasks that we dread, that are part of our job, and enabling AI to perform those tasks so that we can devote ourselves to the most fulfilling aspects of our job. And so you kind of get up in the morning eager to go to work, because what you face when you go to work is a bunch of problems that you're happy to think about and try to solve. That's one thing that would improve people's lives. In the social domain, I don't know. Even in the more general intellectual domain, I'm worried. What I'm worried about is that it will make people feel like there's really not much need to think hard about anything. And that is likely to coarsen the discourse. You can get an answer in 10 minutes to a very complicated question, a complete review of the literature. And then you skim read this complete review of the literature and the hard thinking that you might do if you were on your own, which is as much, how do I select from all this information the stuff that's worth paying attention to? And also, can I find a creative way to put these pieces together? Well, if you've got a tool or a partner who's doing all that for you, then a lot of hard thinking that you might do is likely not to happen. And the consequence of that will be, it's sort of like not exercising your muscles. If you don't use them, you lose them. So now when a situation comes up that really requires you to be able to think hard and long and pay attention and sit at your desk, you don't know how to do any of that because you haven't been training yourself to do any of that. So I'm a little worried that we're going to settle for, in a lot of areas where AI can make a contribution, we're going to settle for mediocrity because AI gives us results, and they're not ridiculous results mostly, but they're also not necessarily outstanding results. And figuring out how to characterize the parts of life where AI is a perfect tool and the parts of life where it's a problematic tool, well, that's what's going to be happening in the next 10 years or so. So this is not a condemnation of AI. It is who the hell knows what the world's going to look like in 10 years assessment of AI.
You've expressed concern about the ratio of true to false statements in the digital world and how it keeps on getting lower and lower, and that young people growing up in this environment might become indifferent to truth.
Yeah, well, that's already happened. Near as I can tell, that's already happened. You know, if it's on the internet, it's true. The one lesson, one of my grandkids is 15 and very, very digitally native kid. And the one thing I try not to be a bully, but the one thing I try to emphasize when we talk about this is that the first thing he needs to ask when he sees something online is, where did it come from? That he should be suspicious. His attitude should be one of suspicion rather than acceptance. And that question has to be asked, and it has to be asked first. And I think schools need to be teaching kids, these digital natives, how important it is to figure out the source of the claim, because God knows the internet itself is not doing anything to police with truth as a criterion. And that has got much worse.
I think what is helpful is, you know, the concept garbage in, garbage out. And so if you, let's say if you go on the internet and you type in, like, I don't know, leadership advice or something, and as, you know, the source material, it's taken from the whole internet, and there's fantastic information, there's mediocre information, and then there is just terrible information. It's all mixed together in a big soup. And so then, you know, what you'll get back is maybe some bland, generic thing, the importance of communication, the importance of, and it's like, it's not wrong, it's not bad, but it's just like blur. One thing I think quite interesting, I can't remember the company, I don't know if it might be a company called Illicit or something like that. And you can take your same concept, like your same question, like give me some leadership advice. However, from your source, I only want you to pick peer-reviewed scientific journals from 2020 to 2025 with at least 50 or 100 like citations or some version of that. And so you can be hyper specific on what comes in on the front end. And I think that, I don't know how many people are engaging in tools like this, or maybe a lot, maybe not. That is, I think, an interesting angle to take, where you're very intentional about actually what comes in, you know, crap in, crap out. And if we can get really quality in, then actually I'm, you know, more optimistic for quality results.
No. That is encouraging. And most people wouldn't use the kind of filter you just described, but some would. And at least it might make people generally attentive to the question, where did this come from? The problem with AI as it's currently presented to us is that we don't know where it comes from. You can ask it to give you some references, but you don't know how much influence those references had on the output that it gave you. And even the people who design it don't know. That's the thing. I think what scares people so much is that when you take somebody, a super geek, and you say, how did ChatGPT come up with this? And they can't answer it. They can tell you that they fed the whole internet in, and what the neural network was that produced intelligent outputs, but they can't tell you in a particular instance what produced that output. It's as much a black box to them as it is to you. And I think what scares people is that it could, somehow get out of control, is that the people who designed it don't know how exactly it's working. And they can't, because of the complexity of it, and because, we don't know how minds work. We've been studying that for a very long time, and people say surprising things, and then we say, well, where'd you come up with that? And you won't have any trouble answering that question, but there's no reason to believe that the answer you give is remotely true. You don't know how you came up with that. It just somehow popped into consciousness, which is not to say it isn't true, and it isn't serious, but you don't have access to the processes that produced it. And much of our behavior in the world, much of our thinking is like that. We get the output, we're aware of the input, but the processes between those two are not accessible to us. I'll repeat what I said when you first brought this up. I think it's crazy to make predictions, because we are in the earliest stages of both understanding and then trying to shape what this will look like going forward. And I'll be dead, pretty sure, before the final story is written on what AI became. I hope, for my sake of my grandchildren, that it becomes something that makes their lives better.
As we spoke just before hitting record, my girlfriend and I are awaiting the birth of our first child, literally any day now. She's 9 months, 10 days pregnant. And what skills or character traits do you predict will be most helpful for the world she's entering?
I think there are a few things that really strike me as very important, and it partly depends on what stage of development the kid is at. But I think it's incredibly important to try to be able to take the perspective of your child at every stage of development. What does the world look like to this 2-year-old? What does the world look like to this 3-year-old? Why is she upset? And, my grandmother used to say, little children, little problems, big children, big problems. And so if you get good at it, when the kinds of issues you face are relatively small and manageable, then you maybe will be able to be good at it when your kid's life gets more complicated and figuring things out gets harder. So to me, that's really important, is to try to see the world as your child sees the world. And I think you have to be willing. There's a wonderful book called The Blessings of a Skinned Knee, written by a developmental clinical psychologist. And it's about the importance of letting kids fail. And so here, too, we were talking about sweet spots. You want to create an environment where your child is protected, but not too protected. And it's very hard to figure out what that is, because it keeps changing. I don't think it occurred to people until the last decade that sending their kids to school was itself a dangerous thing for parents to do. But in the United States, it has become dangerous to send your kids to school. So making sure that your kid has enough freedom to occasionally get hurt and learn from it, and making sure that when your kid gets hurt, it's never too bad, is an ongoing struggle. It was a struggle my wife and I had, and we would vacillate between too protective and too neglectful, and our kids' behavior taught us how to calibrate. And that brings to the third thing, and then I sound wiser than I am here. Another book that I was influential to me when I was writing my book on wisdom, a developmental psychologist who interviewed parents about how they decided how to parent. One mom said, "My children raised me up," which is to say that her view is that she learned how to be a parent from her children. And so listening and watching and being open that they have as much to teach you as you have to teach them, I think is a good way to go into this terrifying phase of life you're about to enter.
It's been such a pleasure speaking to you. 8 years later, it's as fascinating as ever, and I am...
You're a treat to talk to.
I've loved this. Thank you so much. It's so... I'm gonna have to rewatch this multiple times and pen and paper, take lots of notes. Thank you.
Great, wonderful.